When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back. This is episode 137, When to Ask for Help. I'm Matt, that's Mike, and this week we'll be discussing the nuances. I don't know. Correct me in the comments and have a fight down there. Actually, please don't. Keep it civil. But of how and when to ask for help. Now, if this sounds interesting to you, or you want to criticize me, you can go and support or support the show. Hopefully support the show. Don't criticize me for how I say nuances. Nuances? I don't know.
It's nuances. It's definitely nuances.
Nuance? For sure it's nuances.
100%.
I've definitely heard it said both ways, though, right?
If it's said nuances, it's wrong.
Okay, well, I've definitely, 100% I've definitely heard that, and, not rare enough for me to not be curious. And it's also one of those words in an email where I would have that in my, sentence, and I would be immediately being like, I'm going to rephrase this because I don't know how to say that. So anyway, if this sounds interesting to you, and now it really should, you want to support the show, you can go check us out on Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. And now, this is a Mike Heavy episode. Mike wrote all the show notes, so please, sir, take it away.
All right. This kind of topic came up a few episodes ago, I think, where I think it was with Killian for the Polypane episode, where he was kind of like, I really encourage all my employees to constantly ask for help. And I was like, okay, well, that's a good topic to talk about, because I feel like for myself especially, I really don't know when to ask for help. And I've been trying to get better at that. I have a team of people that I can ask now. We have a whole Discord server, shout out to our, HTML All Things Discord server. They're great. And if you just, throw a question in there, you're going to get at least some direction for the most part, especially if you're kind of persistent. Sometimes it takes a little time, but regardless. So it's one of those things that I'm not good at. So I did kind of my own deep dive and my own research and my own testing, and I'm going to kind of share that with everyone else right now. So from what I understand, there's obviously no silver bullet for every problem that arises, and how to ask it and when to ask it. There's no I can't tell you okay, if you're stuck on this for 3 seconds or 4 seconds, then move on to this, and if you're stuck on that, then ask the question. It's not going to work the same for everyone, and it's not going to work for the same for every team. Some teams out there are very open, and they're sitting in a room together and they're constantly talking and no one cares, and you're just constantly firing questions back and forth, and that's good. If you have that kind of team and you work great together, that's great. But some teams really rely on deep work. Some teams really rely on schedules. So in those kind of scenarios, it's a little bit difficult to kind of follow a standard pattern of okay, if I'm stuck on this for 5 minutes, I'm going to go bother that guy every 5 minutes and make sure that he's, I'm getting my questions answered. So you're going to have to kind of judge for yourself based on your team. But I'm going to give you kind of an overview of what I consider to be something that could potentially benefit you and your team for when to ask for questions. I'm also, in the next segment after when to ask, I'm also going to talk about how to ask and some tools that can help you when you're asking questions as well. So when you're first starting out in a career, right? So it's going to be very different for every single point in your career when and how you're going to be asking the questions. But when you're first starting out, it's important to learn something for yourself, obviously. But you're also in this position where you don't have a base usually. You don't have a good set of skills for finding answers to questions. And if you just go blindly into, the sea of answers, you might start picking up some bad habits. I know for myself, I've definitely picked up a few bad habits here and there where I kind of like to grind too much on a problem, and I sometimes reach for too simple of a solution or too complicated of a solution just to get past it. Whereas if I would just ask for help and direction, I could have gotten somewhere a lot more efficient and a lot more standard, rather than going through 3 different loopholes to get there. So that's why I'm kind of bringing this up, because when you're starting out, it's actually more important for you to ask questions than, let's say, you're in the intermediate developer, senior developer kind of range. So in my opinion, and other people's opinion from what I've read, if you're stuck on a problem in that 5 to 10 minute range, you've done a quick Google search, you've checked your own notes, you've checked the company's FAQ or something like that for problems, the knowledge base, and the knowledge base of maybe the framework that you're working on, like just a quick check of all those, and there's nothing obvious that stands out to you. I think in that 5 to 10 minute range when you're just starting out is perfectly fine for you to start reaching out. And I said before, every team is different, and you don't want to, obviously you're not going to be reaching out every 5 to 10 minutes. You're not going to get stuck, most likely. Everything that you do is not going to get you stuck. But if you're asking a question every once in a while and you're stuck on something for 5 to 10 minutes, I think that's perfectly reasonable. And I think a team should be happy to help you, because a lot of the times, like, you'll have a mentor, you'll ask them a lot. You'll have your coworkers, your team, you can ask them. And what that allows you to do as well is when you're asking them and going that back and forth, you're going to get some good information about how they find answers to questions. Because as much as we want to say that we know everything, if we're like an intermediate developer or whatever, we don't. Obviously, we don't. And sometimes a junior developer or someone just starting out will ask us a question, and the first instinct that I have is like, okay, I don't know the answer to that question, but I can find it out. Like if it's a question about some sort of Vue.js property, right? Like some sort of way to bind variables in Vue.js. I don't know. Maybe I won't know that off the top of my head, and I'll go through the process of finding out. And the great thing is if I'm answering that question for a junior developer, I can be like, hey, let's take a look at this together, and I'll show them the process of how I get to that answer. And that process is way more important than the actual answer that you get at the end of it. So when you're just starting out, it's important to not only obviously understand the answers that you're given and know the questions to ask, but also be very diligent in figuring out the process with which the person got to the answer. Obviously, sometimes it's going to be like an immediate, I know that answer to that question, but you can kind of probe even, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. You can probe a little bit and be like, how did you know that answer? And they'll tell you, okay, well, back in the day, I did this, I asked someone else or something like that. And maybe sometimes that won't help, but a lot of the time they'll tell you the kind of process that they got to that answer. And that's the more important thing to learn when you're at the starting stage. So also, asking questions at an early stage allows you to get some insight into how the company's code structure works as well. Because the more a person kind of looks over your shoulder and looks at your code and sees what you're doing, the more chances they have at correcting you and putting you on the right path to their company's policies, the structure, and get you on the right path for like the right fundamentals for that company's code base, right? So that's another positive about asking questions early on, because you get to build kind of more relationships with your team. You get to build better principles, better practices as you're working. And it's not, a lot of the time it can feel awkward to ask questions because you're like, well, no one else is asking questions, or I don't want to feel like an idiot or something like that. But really, the people that are involved and really wanting to complete a task are the people that are going to be asking more questions. And the people that are silent and are slowly kind of grinding through the task are less likely to come up with the correct answer a lot of the times. They might get there at some point, but it might be like some backwards way, and then they'll put in their pull request, and a senior developer review it and be like, well, why did you do it this way? And why didn't you follow our practices? Whereas if you asked that question early on, they could have pointed you in the right direction.
Well, I actually have a thing about that, though, too, is I remember we had a teacher in college that said that one of the kind of rules, I don't know whether it was a rule of the office or his rule or what it was, but it was sort of this almost unspoken rule that if someone, because he was a developer, if someone in the office in his department, who would also, chances are, be a developer, had their headphones on, to not disturb them. Now, the thing is that kind of goes back to, and he mentioned this too, that goes back to that sort of deep work sort of state that we've discussed several times on the show, where you kind of get into some people call it the flow, or the deep work, whatever you want to call it. But it's that sort of like you're in the zone and you're just sort of getting through whatever it is you're doing. It doesn't have to just be code. Now, here's the issue, though, is that I find anyway, and not that we work in a public, or not, it wouldn't be necessarily public, but a crowded, I suppose, office. But I find that people nowadays, short of them having to constantly answer the phone or something like that, or constantly talk to people in the office, they will oftentimes actually just have headphones on by default, because there's lots to listen to, music, podcasts, et cetera, list goes on. So I think that, and I don't really have a solution unless you kind of do, Mike, but this is kind of one of those things where a lot of the time people don't want to ask for help because they feel like they're bothering people and whatever. The issue is that if you are interrupting a deep work session, a workflow session, whatever you want to call it, then you are actually interrupting them.
Absolutely.
And then you have this issue of you're trying to get some help. You're also trying to get some I guess cred, like you're trying to like talk to them and like get a little bit of social credit with them, because you're new there, you're trying to like make some relationships or whatever, and now you've pissed them off effectively. And so I don't know whether there would be an unspoken rule where you'd have to get used to it in the office, where maybe it's that headphone rule, or maybe it's like, Jim is always skipping lunch because that's when he does his stuff or whatever. I don't really know how that's handled, but I think that that's a really big struggle that people will have. And it doesn't have to be just coding either. It can be for anything. Like there's been times where I'll like approach somebody for either for help or because I literally need something from them. And it'll be like kind of met with not like anger or like they're going to attack you, but like enough disdain where they kind of give you the side eye, like, oh, like, sure, here's the paper, Matt. And it's like, well, like, what would you like me to do? You're blocking me, So I don't really know how one handles that, but I do think that that's a major anxiety when asking for help or knowing when to, and probably a big barrier to asking for help. Like a lot of people will just be like, nope, not entering that social situation.
Yeah. And you're right. There is a lot of instances where you probably don't want to interrupt someone, but it's usually, at least in an office-based environment, pretty obvious when they're like zoned in, right? If you're looking at them and they're like fully focused on the screen, headphones on, and typing away, probably not a good time to ask them. But if they're kind of leaning back, looking around and stuff like that, like you can tell by social cues if they're up for some sort of conversation. That, at least that's my experience in an office before. On the other side of it, and another strategy that I like to use, when I start a new project with a new team, I'll ask them, hey, when do you guys want to communicate? Like, when are you, always up for communication? Do you want me to ping you? Like, we'll set up the schedule or the ways of communication right away at the start of a project, right? So they'll be like, oh, just, I'm up for it anytime, but like ping me on Slack or ping me on Discord. And, I'll message you if I'm available to chat. And I do the same thing with my developers. I'm like, hey, always reach out at any time on Skype or whatever, and I'll let you know if I'm available at that very moment. And if not, then I'll give you like another time where I am available. And if I'm in a deep work session, I'll just tell them, hey, I'm just working right now. I'll contact them later. So I think using the chat platform, if you're not sure, gives the other developer an opportunity to stay deep focused and kind of, not interrupt them the same way that if you were to go up to their desk, tap them on their shoulder for them to turn around, because that usually kind of takes them out of it, right? And it's a little bit too distracting. So that's kind of how we handle it. And a lot of the times, like, again, when you're starting out with a mentor, they'll be like, hey, I like to do a lot of my work in the mornings. And that, for me, I'm just kind of pointing out for myself. Like, I like my work. My deep work is usually done anywhere between like 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. till about 1 p.m. So in that time, I'm usually not available for any sort of like troubleshooting or anything like that. Usually, sometimes I am, but regardless, those are my deep work hours. So I'll tell them that right away, so that they know to keep their questions for later on in the day. And that works out decently well. For like, it's one of those things, like, it's tough to know right away. And usually a developer, if they're like decent social skills and stuff like that, will tell you right away if you're interrupting them, and you can kind of gauge based on that. And they're not going to get mad at you for it, because you're a new developer. Like, if you're a new hire at a company, everyone knows that you're going to need the most help. And usually they'll align your schedules if they have a good hiring process and a good onboarding process. They'll align their schedules to help you because they know if you're ramping up, then that means you're taking the load off of them, and that kind of works like it's the reciprocity of that relationship. Obviously, in some companies, it's a lot more difficult, and some people are a lot more, withholding, or they're just kind of cold. And those are those are tough situations because you might not be able to ask those people for help. And you can try a different way. Like, again, if they're not really good with giving you help over face-to-face, maybe try sending them an email and seeing when they reply. Maybe they do really well structured email responses, and that's their thing. And that's perfectly fine as long as it works for you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I will say that, if you work with, usually it's higher than level 1 IT, because usually level 1 IT has like a structured, like, hey, you chat with us, or you come to the desk, or like there's usually only one form of communication, and that changes per company. Sometimes it's multiple. But when you talk to like a higher level IT where it gets escalated to them, like level 2, level 3, whatever the structure is in your company, oftentimes the communication kind of opens up, and there will be times where they will ask you, hey, do you mind if we do email? Or, hey, do you mind if we do phone? Or do you want to do a mix of both? Like, they will ask you straight up. And it's not just like you opening a chat window on the website and talking to that level 1, because that's very structured. It's like them vetting you, being like, is their issue actually level 2, like worthy, effectively, I guess. But there is that. And I think that is because like those levels of IT, like obviously sometimes there's company policy that demands that they use email or whatever, but oftentimes it's actually because they want, like, that person is better at email. But then if you have a similar issue in the future and you get put to a different tech, that other person might do better via call. And I've actually had it where I'm like, hey, I'm available for a call at this time, or email me, and they just never even acknowledge the phone number, because clearly they don't want that. They just want to do the email. So like, I mean, that's fine. Like, whatever, it's to each their own, but that's one thing. I also want to bring up one other thing as well, actually. And like Mike and I have been experiencing this, and other people are experiencing this too outside of tech as well. And it's a weird, I don't know whether it's a new phenomenon, an old phenomenon. I don't know. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there's this weird thing that I'm noticing more now, which is why I'm mentioning it now. Whether it's always been there, I don't know. Where communication has just sort of broken down to the point where stuff isn't read, stuff isn't acknowledged, stuff that's obviously right in front of somebody isn't answered properly. And I don't want to like get into, specific situations with everyone, because this happens, several times a day at this point. But it's something as simple as you send an email to, like, if I sent an email to Mike, that's a prime example. I sent an email to Mike and he was trying to, repair a hard drive. I don't know. And I tell him like, hey, go into the command prompt in Windows with the hard drive plugged in via external drive and via external enclosure, and run this command. And he spends all day, like, he reads the email, he says, yeah, thanks, Matt, but he doesn't actually read it. He spends all day trying to figure out how to repair this hard drive in the command prompt. Can't figure it out for whatever reason. And then he contacts me and says, like, I can't get this to work. And I'm like, did you then, like, via phone call or via that email, it'll be like, hey, well, did you do this? And he's like, well, I didn't read that. And it's sort of like, okay. There's also this like phenomenon, and I don't know whether it's new, old, whatever, where people just don't communicate, where they just don't bring stuff up. So prime example, actually, recently, one of my friends had a fire alarm pulled in their apartment building. I think it was a legit, like, actual problem, some sort of like that the fire department had to deal with. I don't know the details. And anyway, so they evacuate, they do the procedure, the fire drill, whatever, and, well, not the fire drill, but they do the same thing that they wouldn't do in a fire drill, leave the building, blah, 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 whatever, gather in a certain spot, whatever they got to do. And the fire department shows up, does their thing, and then they're on the other side of the building, and they just get in the truck and leave. They don't communicate. So everyone in the middle of the night is just standing outside being like, can we go back inside? No one communicated. And what's bad about this, and what I'm finding is that this type of communication, I think, is actually leading to people not asking for help. And the worst thing is I'm starting to do this now, where I'm realizing that I'll write out, like, I'll make a really nice detailed email. I'm a kind of a detail freak when it comes to email. If you ever like work with me on technical stuff, especially stuff like migrations and stuff, I ask 1,000,001 questions because I just want to be ready, because I know something's going to go wrong. So I want to be ready. And if I'm going to like spend time, literally 20, 30 minutes sometimes, depending on the details of the email, writing out a huge email, and you just send like a yeah, or you just don't answer it, or you just don't read it, like you answer it, but you just don't read it. And that comes to fruition. Like, I'm aware of that. I now just kind of don't talk to you, and I'll just like start like pulling plugs and stuff like this according to what I think is right for you. And it will cause like, hey, like, why is this down? Be like, oh, like the service upgraded or whatever. And like the service is down, like you have to re-sign in. And I could have told these people to re-sign in, or I could have told these people that like, oh, we're doing WordPress maintenance or whatever it was. But I just don't bother because I know that they're not bothering. And so, and I know that's bad because now I'm starting to do it in my personal life. Someone sends me a text that I just don't warrant important, I just don't answer it now. And like, I know that's not good. But like, I think that this is like a phenomenon that's happening where there's like this communication breakdown. And when you're asking for help, you're kind of, if you will, at the disadvantage. You know, whether or not like asking for help is encouraged in your workspace or not, you are still the person that needs something from somebody, and you're not like they're not like paying them $1 in return for the help or something, right? So you're in need of something. And I think these communication breakdowns, if they're as widespread as I'm seeing, and I'm a very small sample size, is leading to people not asking for help. And then you just have like, you have a junior dev, for like total made up scenario, a junior dev on a job for God knows how long, let's say 2 weeks. They haven't even got the header working or whatever, something basic, because they didn't ask for help, and they just like kind of threw something together that wasn't even what you wanted. And there was no communication of the senior person that assigned them to it asking, you know, hey, like checking in every couple of days or whatever, like, hey, how's it going? And there was no communication up. And that communication's broken. It's just sort of like, eh. And I don't know whether that, like, I don't know. Like, I mean, you can weigh in on this, Mike. I don't know whether this is like a widespread thing, whether this is just people bad at communications, whether this is a new thing, an old thing, but it's not good. And there's been times actually where, and this is maybe what has led me to it, and I'll finish here, is what maybe has led me to it, where I will like communicate something, like I'll just say like a quick update, like I'll just be like FYI, blah, blah, blah. And I'll just get like sort of like, oh, I didn't need to hear that. And so when I hear stuff like that, it's sort of like, oh, okay, well then I'm just not going to talk to you then. Like, I'll just go along my merry way, do my job the best I can, only talk to you when it's like literally an emergency, or I literally have to talk to you, and you'll just get no updates. Fair enough. And like, I know that sounds crazy. I know that sounds like spiteful, but it has like actually come down to that in some cases. I'm not saying that I'm doing this to new clients and stuff like this, yada, yada. I'm not like being a dick, but like, if that is the precedent set forth, now that becomes my norm. And like I said, now I'm finding that it's becoming a habit, and it's starting to seep into a little bit of my personal stuff, which I've been curbing and stopping like immediately because it's not good. But I don't know, Mike, like, what's your thoughts on this? Like, I know it's not really even really a tangent. I think it's actually kind of almost foundational to asking for help.
Yeah, I think, there's a couple things to address there. But one, the foundational part of it that's related to the asking for help is that it's definitely a two-way street, right? When you're onboarding a junior developer, or when you're like onboarding a developer in general, there should be very clear communication that, hey, we want you to ask for help, and this is how we want you to do it, right? And then they're like up for it, and then they can ask for help, and hopefully it goes the way that the onboarding process has already told them it will. Now, if there's none of that when you're first starting out, yeah, the junior developer is going to be scared because they weren't told that they can ask for help. They weren't like told even who to ask for help. And then everyone, like, they could send out emails, no one reads. Like, that's the other part of your discussion, Matt. Like, as we've learned, a lot of people, I'm not going to say everyone, but a lot of people don't read. Like, just really don't read. They open up an email that you sent them, read the last line, which is like, thanks, or something like that, and then respond to you based on your last line. They won't read any of the body. They won't read the start. They won't read anything. And then
Correct.
You have to kind of go one by one line by one line, essentially, to them after that, and be like, okay, what about this? What about this? Like, I don't know how many email exchanges I've had where I've sent like 4 questions. Like I try to limit myself. Like I already know this problem, and I really try to limit myself in my structure of my emails. Like they're really, really concise usually. And even then, they'd answer like the last question, and that's it. And I'm like, well, there's like 3 other questions very clearly labeled as questions in there with question marks and everything. Why didn't you go in and, answer those questions? And I mean, it's just the reality of the situation that we're living in right now. Like that's the reality of the world. I was with another person recently, and I was helping them out on some problems. And there was like these problems were like question answer, like standard question and answer problems. And they would go to the page and then just start like, look at an example or something like that, and then just start typing in a text box. And I'm like, what are you typing? Like, what's going on right now? And they just started typing, and I'm like, what's the question? Like, what are you answering? They're like, I don't know. I'm just like looking at this example and I'm writing. Like they're blasting off based on just one little bit on the page when there's like 4 or 5 different questions that they have to be answered. Like it's literally like, I don't know what was happening. I didn't know what was happening at the time. I was like, is this how like assignments are done now at school? Or is is this how assignments are done in like courses at this point? Like, is this, I don't know. It was crazy, but like you've got to slow down. Like I feel like as a developer, sometimes we're just trying to go too fast. Like we're trying to learn too much. We're going too fast. And therefore we have these techniques of like only reading a little bit here and there and then trying something out. Like we've even preached in being like, hey, you got to just start coding. You can't read. But really, like, that doesn't mean you can't read everything. That just means that in some situations, it's a good idea to apply skills and then go back and read a little bit more, and then apply some skills and then go back and read a little bit more. It doesn't mean you have the opportunity to just cut out reading altogether. I don't know why that is a thing. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. This is kind of like going off on a little bit of a tangent, but it is related for sure. Because again, when you're answering questions or when you're creating or when you're asking questions, it's really important to have the skill of reading. Because when you're asking questions, if you didn't read anything before, you're going to be asking potentially not very good questions. Like if you have a problem and you didn't even go bother, looking it up on Google, looking it up in your documentation, looking it up anywhere, and you're just going to ask like, hey, what's the variable name that I should write here? Or what's the, what's just some really basic question that during the interview process that you had with the company, you like kind of already should have known. That could be a problem. Where on the other hand, if you go and you actually follow through and kind of like, this is more part of my second segment, but I'll talk about it now, and actually go and, read a little bit, answer, like, type into Google what your problem is and read the first couple posts, see if that they apply, check to see other resources that you have available. Again, a knowledge base real quickly. Like, just maybe write that down real quick, what you did, and then go to someone and be like, hey, I'm having this problem. This is kind of what I did to solve it. Like, I followed these steps. That's a totally different thing. Even if the question is really simple, and even if, like, for that developer, they can easily answer it. As soon as they see that you followed the simple steps of troubleshooting, they can be like, oh, that's no problem. Like, and they can correct your steps. That's another really big advantage to actually doing something before going to someone with a question. Because that, again, I want to bring it back to that process of finding the answer being way more important than the actual answer, because that's what you're going to be selling in the future. Troubleshooting and questions and answers are literally, that's our bread and butter. Like, that's what we need to be good at. Like, realistically, to be a good developer, you need to be able to solve problems, and solving problems means asking the right questions, means figuring out how to research it yourself, means, implementing solutions that you find. It's all not easy stuff. Even though, like, at the beginning, it can seem like, you're asking dumb questions, but really, as long as you follow those steps and the person that you're asking to can see that you followed those steps, they can help you 100%. And they will be more than happy because they can see that you've already put in the effort. Whereas if someone, again, came to me and they're just like, hey, I don't know what to type here. Like, I don't know, should I open up the code editor or should I not open up the code editor? And you're like, okay, well, like, you might be a little bit too far gone at that point.
Well, here's and we're not going to solve these issues on this show. I want to be clear, like these overarching, like, communication issues. But I will, like, there's a weird it's not weird, actually. It's just the internet, actually, a little bit. So I'm wondering whether people are, because you were mentioning Googling issues, right? So you're Googling issues, and you can do that on programming issues, of course, but you can do that on anything. Like, hey, how do I file this form with the government or something? I don't know. Just whatever it is. Like, how do I plug in this USB port properly or something? You can Google anything. And I think there's this culture online now where a lot of people view, or what's like commonly called as lurk, and a lot of people don't post questions. And I think that it might be due to, and then this is totally just off the cuff, so I haven't like done my research, but there's a lot of forums, whether it be Reddit posts, I don't care, a lot of communities out there where when you ask a question, you get either downvoted, or you get told like, oh, let me Google that for you, or you get told, oh, this is a duplicate. Like that's a famous one on Stack Overflow. This is a duplicate, and if it isn't, just make another one, and whatnot, stuff like that, or comments like, oh, like this should be simple, or maybe if you were more organized, you wouldn't have this problem, stuff like that, or oh, well, I had a friend that had like a question about managing pay stubs. I don't even remember what the heck he was doing with them, but he had like a question about like the legality around it and like, I guess, labor board stuff or something. I don't really know. But he was asking some sort of generic question about pay stubs, and the response he got was, well, maybe if you were more organized 12 months ago, this wouldn't have happened. And it's sort of like, all right, well, I guess I'll just go back in time, be more organized, and then I don't know, shoot you an email. Like, there just seems to be this
toxicity.
This toxicity, but it's also like moderation of content, right? Because there's so many people online that can all talk at the same level. Like most, anyone for the most part can write a Reddit post. Most people can write a Discord message and blah, blah, blah. So like everyone's kind of like yelling, if you will, at the same level, that there needs to be this like cutthroat, like you out of here, you out of here, you out, you're okay, you out. You know what I mean? Like there needs to be this like where they're chopping off, because otherwise it would be like a million and one like, is HTML a programming language? And the next day, is HTML a programming language? So there needs to be this like moderation, like kind of almost cutthroating, if you will. That's a gamer term, if you will. You know what I'm trying to say? Like there needs to be this like this strictness, but it's ended up where I think honestly like people are afraid to ask, and I think it goes into real life too. Where there's when to ask a question should really be rather simple, and sure there's like some, and we're going to talk about them more, but like there's these complex sort of social constructs, I guess, that are associated with asking for help and stuff like that you could get into, but you should be able to figure those out slowly with experience. In general, you should just be able to ask for help, and yet there's this like huge anxiety, like there's like a bunch of anxious thoughts for some people around asking for help. And I think one of the issues might be that sort of internet culture, where this is why a lot of people lurk or just like read forums. They don't post because it's like they don't want to get, yelled at, banned, called out for something, told their thing's a duplicate, called an idiot, those type of things. I don't know. Like maybe that's the issue. Like I said, we're not going to solve this here. But like maybe this is where we're going. Yeah. Maybe it's just going to get worse because we're using the internet more and more. Maybe it's just going to get worse. Who knows? But it's just interesting that like I wouldn't ask for help online. I just look for what things that other people ask for. And only after extensive research do I ask. And 50% of the time I get marked as a duplicate. 50% of the time I get kicked off. 50% of the time I get called an idiot. And then I'm just like, oh, okay. And then sometimes I just delete the post. Like, oh, I'm just an idiot then, so I'll just delete this.
So, I mean, that's what we're trying to solve here.
Right.
Like that exact thing, because I was very similar to that. I've gotten slightly better at it, but I'd still say I'm not there yet. Like I should be. I should be asking better questions. But regardless, it's one of those situations where, yes, there's a lot of toxicity online. And that is 100% attributing to the fact that people don't ask as many questions as they should. Because we see it on ourselves, we see it on other people. They're afraid to ask because people are extremely arrogant online. I think we can change that to a certain degree for ourselves, right? By asking the right places. Like Stack Overflow, in my opinion, is not the place for a new developer to ask a question. It's just not the place for a new, like it used to be, absolutely. Not anymore. Stack Overflow is the place where you ask a question about an extremely specific like framework technology that you've been stuck on forever, and you just throw it up on there. The other thing, like where I like to ask all my questions, as more of like a intermediate to senior developer, and I'll get to that like in a second. But where I like to ask my questions is like on a GitHub issues page, because again, most of my problems arise from complex frameworks, complex integrations with other frameworks, stuff like that. And when you have the when you're in that situation, and you kind of like Googling can only take you so far. Those issue pages are great because again, they're very much directed at exactly the problem, and the people that are supporting them are very much in line with like, we need to solve as many issues as possible to make our product better so that we can expose it to as many people as possible. So they're very much willing to answer your question and try to figure out if there is there. So I'll always go on a GitHub issues page of whatever package that I'm using. I'll check if the current issue that I'm asking has been asked or solved. So there's like a closed and an open tab. I'll check both tabs to make sure that there's nothing relative to it. And then I'll just post the question there based on the template that they have for their issues. Everyone's kind of different, but that's a great way to ask a question, and a great, and also like, again, it's part of the when to ask a question as well, is again, when you have like a specific library that you're using that's not integrating with your code. Because if you're going to have that issue, maybe down the line someone else is going to have that issue, and having that documented in the issues tab is really important, because I'm not the only one that does this. Everyone else, like not everyone, but a lot of people will go to the issues tab, check the open and close questions, and then go on from there. And a lot of the times you're actually going to solve your problem by doing that.
There's also very few like problem solving things, I guess. There's also very few problem solving things that feel better than solving like a core issue or finding a core issue.
Yeah.
Like when you're like, I've done this a million times, I swear this is done correctly. And it ends up being an issue with that software or like that app. And it's like, a core issue where it's like you're calling on an LED to blink and it's like making the speaker buzz or something, something where it's just doing it blatantly wrong. And you're like, I swear I'm not calling that speaker. Like, I know I'm telling this LED to blink. And then they're like, oh yeah, there's a bug in the core files or whatever, or in this library or whatever it needs to be that we need to fix. And you're like, well, all right. Like, I feel pretty justified now.
That's absolutely true. And I do really like that feeling of finding that core issue. Because I think it's good for the developers too that are working on it, right? That's why they're doing it open source, is because a lot of companies will open source their own software that they're using in production because they need help figuring out all the issues and solving all the issues. Mm-hmm. So that's one reason to open source. And we've talked about open source before, but that's one of the reasons to open source, is to get the team mentality, everyone, like all the pairs of eyes as possible looking at it and finding all the issues that you have there, whether they be security, whether they be performance, because those are the stuff that's hard to find. Like, yeah, you can get functionality there. Like, as like a small team, you can get your functionality to be good, right? And work the way you want it. But finding all the security vulnerabilities in your platform, finding all of the performance metrics that you could like change to maybe make it a slightly faster, finding the the integrations that don't work, those are really difficult and require either a lot of developers, a lot of testing, or again, just an infinite amount of pairs of eyes on it for people to look at, use, and find those issues. So it's part of the open source community to ask those questions. And it's very much not frowned upon to ask questions in the issues tabs, especially if you've done the due diligence of just checking if it's already been asked before. But even if you haven't, a lot of the times they'll just reference the question, right? Like if you have done the due diligence and you didn't find it, sometimes that happens. And someone will just reference the question where it's solved. And they'll just give you like a little reference tab. Now you might take that as a little bit of like a slap in the face, but it's not. I guarantee you, like I've done that before. It's not. I'm not intending that to be a slap in the face. I'm intending that to solve your problem, because it's showing where you can find your problem, and you can close the issue when you find it. So there is certainly a lot of toxicity back to that online, like back to the toxicity problem. There's certainly a lot, but there's ways around it. Again, it's a two-way thing. In a company, if you're starting out, make sure that you are upfront with when can I ask questions, who can I ask questions to, and stuff like that. If you're a company hiring, make sure you're upfront with the new developers about when to ask questions, how to ask questions. You know what I mean. Like a lot of the time, a good company would be like, ask questions as much as you want. And obviously, if you're going to ask a question every minute, it's going to be a problem. But you're not. Like, you're not going to ask a question every minute. It's just not the thing. Like, when I say 5 to 10 minutes, that doesn't mean you're going to be asking a question 5 to 10 minutes. That means you've been stuck on a problem for 5 to 10 minutes, and then you can ask a question, right? When you're an intermediate developer, just to go to the next topic here a little bit, if you're stuck on a problem from like 30 minutes to 1 hour, that's also a decent time to start, reaching out and asking some questions, some general questions about the problem, because you can solve it much quicker. And giving yourself that little bit more time rather than a junior developer will kind of hone your skills, make your troubleshooting skills better, because now you're going deeper. Now you're going to like, the GitHub pages. Now you're going to the issues tabs. Now you're going to like, deeper into Google. You're going into the documentation of the library. You're understanding that a little bit more. Like all of that knowledge that you're gaining while you're trying to troubleshoot is very important. So it's important to sometimes take some time and actually troubleshoot and not immediately reach out. So as you go up in rank, I guess, at a company, or as you go up in rank as a developer in general, you're probably going to ask less questions, but you should never get to the point where you're not asking questions, in my opinion. Like you should always be willing to ask a question. You shouldn't be at the point where like, I know everything and I'm never going to ask a question. No, it's just not going to happen. A lot of the time when you're going to be like integrating into a new technology, when you're going to integrate to a new library or a framework, it's important to like maybe bring yourself back to that junior developer phase, because now you're starting something new. Maybe you should start asking questions really quickly to the people that know the answers, and then slowly work your way back up in terms of that kind of situation.
I have a question about this now, though. So you're mentioning, you mentioned some times there, 30 to 1 as an intermediate developer, or whatever. I'm sure times will change based on project and stuff and companies, whatever. That's fine. But here's the question, though, is when you're working on something rather complex, so something like programming, there's a lot of strength that comes from being able to solve the issue, but being able to solve the issue sometimes requires it to be without a time pressure. Now, there's always a time pressure. There's always a deadline. There's always this. There's always that. But how would you say you deal with it? Because this is what I do. Is I've been doing a lot of server stuff recently, so I haven't really been coding. And what I do is if I have an issue, I just go like, okay, here we go. And then I just like stay up, which is probably not good, but I just like stay up until it's done. Sometimes to like 7 in the damn morning. So I'm basically just pull the night shift just to ensure that something gets done, gets fixed, gets repaired, or I understand what happened or whatever. And I just sort of like dig my heels in and do it. But if I, during that time, were to, say, okay, let's do this, and be constantly worried about like a ratio or be constantly looking at the clock, I probably wouldn't have even solved it in the same amount of time that it took me, because I would have been worried about the clock. It's sort of like that classic trope of, if you're worried about falling asleep, then you're not going to fall asleep.
You shouldn't be worried about the clock. Like I understand your point of like putting the structure here, but that's why I have like a kind of a range. Mm-hmm. And again, you don't know, because if you were maybe under that at like, hour long time frame, let's say, and you were a little bit worried about the clock, and after an hour you weren't able to progress in your thing and you were asked a question, it doesn't mean you stop trying to look for the answer. You just, you go to the right place, ask the question, then continue looking, and then wait for an answer to come in. Mm-hmm. Maybe an answer will come in, maybe not. Maybe you have to go to a different place to ask a question. That's also part of the deal. But maybe an answer will come in while you're looking for it, and you can reference it. And because you've already invested so much time in looking for the answer, when someone answers you, you have a much better idea of what they're talking about. Like if you ask right away, like to put it back to like the, initial, like right away ask, sometimes the answer will make no sense to you because you haven't looked at it long enough. Right? But that combination of you looking for it and you asking the question, that will be the perfect combination for potentially having that problem solved as quickly as possible. And like for us, Matt, we're in a situation where we're kind of working on our own. Like, you can ask me technically, I can ask you technically, but we're kind of working on two different sets of knowledge and skills. So it's not going to help too much. But if you're in a team environment and if you have deadlines like you were mentioning, it's different. And you do have to kind of worry about that a little bit at least. Because if you're stuck on a problem for hours and hours and hours, yes, it might be good for you to like get through it on your own and all that, but really that's company time, unfortunately. And you really do need to optimize as much as possible. And asking a question, again, does not stop the clock. Does not mean like you ask a question and then you just like sit there and wait for the answer. Like, you're not just like a robot. No, like you just continue to look, but part of your troubleshooting is asking that question.
That's you're asking Google the question too. Like, yeah. I mean, like you're effectively asking Google, whether you ask a colleague, ask Google, whatever, like it's still a part of it. And another thing too, I find, is because and this doesn't always happen, depends on situation, but because you're so deep in that one issue, usually it's like a roadblock issue or like a dam. And then like once you break that, like break through where you're like, oh, that's how you set this to an integer or something, then like the dam breaks and now you rip through like the whole whatever it is you're assigned to in like a third of the time, because you've been in that issue for so long that you've effectively thought of the whole thing. Even if it's in the back of your mind, you've effectively thought of that whole thing so much, but it was just that one block. And now that you've been in it for so long, you're able to just rip through it after that.
Yep. Absolutely. And it usually is like breaking a dam. You kind of go through it and you quickly go. But sometimes, and I've had this happen before, where it's like issue after issue after issue, where all of the issues line up to be like a blocker. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that happens, and it's part of the deal. And especially in this next segment, like this second section with the senior developer part, when you're a senior developer, that's more likely to happen, because now you're in this scenario where there's not a ton of people that can answer your questions. Because usually what a senior developer does is they guide the entire tech stack and the architecture of the project to something that will solve the problem. And based on that, it's sometimes quite complex, because your chosen tech stack could be like 5 different things all intertwined to solve the problem. Now, that might be a bad thing or a good thing, whatever, but the senior developer has that decision-making power. Mm-hmm. And when they do that, they've combined something that's might have never been done before or might have been done very little. And at the more stuff you add onto it, the less people out there that have, done the same thing. So your community of people that can answer your question shrinks. And so it becomes harder and harder and harder. So like, for instance, my current stack right now is extremely unique that we're doing for one of the projects. It's Vue.js, regular HTML, JavaScript, CSS in the public folder, Vue.js for some components, and then it's all packaged with Cordova, and it's run on Android and a little bit of iOS, like some functionality on iOS. And then inside of the Android app, we also connect it to Flutter, a Flutter instance, a Flutter interface. So there's a few native functionalities built with Flutter. So it's like this melding of a bunch of, web and cross-platform technologies that make it into this ball of like unknown entity. And therefore, if there's a problem with the integration part of that, the senior developer usually is on their own. Now, what they can do to kind of alleviate that and what they can do to bring the team together is using their skills, separate the problem out a little bit into different tasks, right? If the problem is severe, separate it out and set their team on troubleshooting each little thing in that task, right? Each little issue. And then not only does that kind of have the cohesiveness and bring the team together a little bit and get them understanding the architecture, but it also kind of frees you up to look at the big picture. And when your team comes back to you, like, okay, I found this on this specific, technology and integration. I found this on this specific, and then another person comes back and I found this. And then you can kind of, while you have the overview, you can put that together. They're getting knowledge of troubleshooting little, smaller things and gathering knowledge and bringing it to you. So it's kind of like that back and forth relationship that allows you to ask questions, allows them to ask questions for you, and it builds up the knowledge of the code base as well while you're doing it. it's a little bit complex, like for sure. But again, when you get to the stage, when you get to that like later development stages where you're the one making the decisions for the project, and you have a team working for you, that's when it becomes like a little bit more difficult to ask questions. But again, rely on other people as well. Like hopefully you have a community of people that can answer some of your questions or point you in the right direction. And it's that thing where you might ask a question of like an even more senior developer than you, and they might not know the answer right away, but they might be able to show you how they would get to that answer. And I just want to always bring it back to that point of like, really pay attention when the person is explaining to you that way that they got the answer, and make sure that when you do get an answer, try to figure out the way that they got there, because again, that's where you're going to learn the most.
Well, the other thing too is that, you know, we've had a discussion before, most recently probably with Monarch, where we discussed the turnover rate of like people changing jobs, and with that comes a lot of contacts that aren't just in the office. So you don't have to just ask for help from people in the office. You know, you have to be careful how you ask questions for security purposes across two different companies. If your buddy that's a little bit more senior dev than you, or is a Windows specialist, you're having a Windows problem, you can't be asking too specific to give away security things of your current company. But you can certainly ask questions to them, and that's more buddy as well. You just shoot them a text message or whatever, the acceptable sort of normal conversation you would have with the guy, and that's it. You just text them, text her, or whatever, and then you can just have a conversation on that. And I've done that. My bosses have done that, where we have some really obscure Windows server issue, and it's like we got to call this guy. Like there's this guy that we know, and we got to call him, because like this is. Like this is out of control, and like the guy will know what knowledge base to look at or something like that, where he'll point you in the right direction, which is huge. Like it's a huge help. And so with the quick turnover rate, one of the benefits is that you start knowing a bunch of people, and if you become sort of friends with them and you talk to them, outside of work, or at least just on your like personal device or whatever, you're just like chatting with them, then that can become another place where you reach out as well. So that if you become the senior dev and they're the senior dev at their company, you're the senior dev at your company, you can, two senior devs can chat without you having to like, you as the senior dev go ask the junior dev, which is probably not going to know the answer because you're having, different issues. Like you have senior dev problems, that junior dev has junior dev problems. So definitely the circle of asking, is the internet, which is the world, if you will, but then you can also ask friends from other companies as well.
Exactly. And like bringing that to my next segment here is how and who to ask for help. We've already touched on a bunch of the stuff that I was going to talk about here, but regardless, that idea that you had of like, you can't share company secrets, but you can for sure bring your code, like the issue that you're having, and create like a little code base that reproduces that issue, right? And that's an exercise and a practice in that how to ask for help part. That's really important, because a lot of people will really avoid doing that because it's a time sink. Like for sure, taking out a problem that it is a serious problem that you just can't solve, and bringing it into its own like repo essentially that only is that problem with none of the other proprietary code around it, so that you can ask the general public for help, is a very good exercise. Like I want to really point that out, because if you can do that quickly eventually, like obviously initially it'll be slow, but if you can start getting to the point where you can take out functionality and put it into its own thing quickly, that's another skill set that you can bring to the table for any team, and they would be happy to have it. That's a really important one. And that's, again, yes, you can ask another developer, another senior developer, another junior, whatever. Like you can ask another developer, one of your friends, with that kind of technique. But it's also really important for asking questions in like the GitHub issues section, right? Because a lot of the time they'll require you to put code that reproduces the issue, and they don't want your whole project. They want just the code that reproduces the issue. And sometimes it is a time investment, absolutely, but it's usually a worthwhile one if you're stuck. And not only does it give you the perspective of taking something out and putting it on its own thing, it'll actually give you, like, when you're doing it, some of the times you're actually going to solve the problem as you're doing it, because you start ripping stuff out. and you're like, okay, this didn't cause the problem. And you rip this out and you just, this didn't cause the problem. And you put that back in and you're like, and then you figure out what specifically caused the problem. And maybe that'll give you a different perspective to actually solve it. And if it doesn't, again, you have that opportunity of now posting it as a separate code base onto a form, or give it to your colleagues or give it to your friends and have them take a look at it. And that's huge. Like whenever someone comes into our Discord server and asks like a very generic question, like, hey, I don't understand why my variable is not setting when I've set it here and it's just being like reset over here. Like, and that's literally like the language they use. The first question after that is like, can you share some code that can reproduce it? Can you make a code pen? Can you just like, put some code that we can copy paste and figure out? You need to show code, and that is a good exercise, and that is a really good technique for asking for help. So the other things, that there's a lot of other kind of ways to ask for help. We've talked about a few, like the strategy of having the process that you've already gone through documented in some way, shape, or form. Like maybe it's in your head, you just went through it, or maybe you just wrote down a couple quick notes like, I looked here, and using that to approach a developer or like one of your team or your mentor and showing them what you did. That's a really important approach, because again, the idea is they can go in and not only give you the answer, but they can also comment on your method of finding the answer. And that's the key that I'm trying to get through everyone's head. That's one of the key takeaways for sure. And that's one of them for sure. And like, I mean, in an ideal world, you'll have to ask follow-up questions about how the person finds the answers themselves. Like, let's say you ask someone a question and they just give you an answer right away, or they give you an answer, like a one-line answer in an email. In an ideal world, they might give you like how they got to that answer, but you might have to follow up and be like, hey, can you just, take me through it? Maybe do like a quick, let's get on a call, or just do a quick write-up about how you got to that answer, because I really want to know. I guarantee you the person that came up with that answer will be happy to show you. They just, in their mind, they just want to get it done as quickly as possible initially so that you can be unblocked. But if you show some initiative showing that you want to learn how they got to that answer, they'll be happy to show you. Also, it's important when working in a team, it's important to utilize each other when asking questions. And this kind of provides an opportunity to have that back and forth thing. So even if you're a junior developer, you should be in the process of answering people's questions as well. Like you should be mixed into the scenario where, like, if someone were to throw out a question, you should have the opportunity to answer it, because answering questions, and I think we all know this, is a really good way to solidify your knowledge and to give you some confidence. And I think it's really important for junior developers to be involved in the answering of questions and not just asking them. And there's also a bunch of tools, or a couple tools here that I'm just going to list off that you can use. I think, again, if you're asking questions online, jumping on a quick, Zoom call or Discord call to share your screen and show reproduce the problem that you're having and show your code base and stuff like that is a really important tool to use. Right. Again, it's back to that code base kind of discussion. Like you want to show the code that's causing the error, not just describe the problem. Describing the problem is great, but you need that code to go along with it 100%. And sometimes it's not going to work out if you like to get on a call, and that's fine. You can just take a quick screen recording of the bug, show the code that you think is causing the bug, because sometimes you're going to be wrong. And then send it off to one of your, team members or like a friend or the Discord group. And that will really kind of solidify the problem for the people, and they can help you get to the answer. The other thing,
one thing I was going to actually mention as well is, as a tool, is having your junior devs write on your intranet, to be clear, intranet wiki is actually a really good learning tool as well. Because one of the things that happens in a larger company or a larger project is like there's the company intranet, meaning like they have websites that are just internal for staff members, team members, whatever. And those wikis become very large. There's a lot of knowledge-based articles, lots of this, lots of that are sort of private to the company for the various departments, accounting, developing, whatever. And developing developers, the technical department, IT, whatever, anything in the tech sector usually gets a pretty large site dedicated to this, depending on, again, size of the company and what they're doing. And I will say that having the junior guys, depending on what it is, use your discretion, but it's hard to develop an internal Google skill. So obviously, if you're searching on the internal wiki is probably formatted a certain way. And you may have to search it differently than you would Google, let's say. You may have to type in the search terms differently, or there's certain tags that the company uses, or there's certain this and that. Having the junior dev, fill in some of those wiki articles, fill in some of those internal KBs or knowledge base articles is actually a good way for them to, one, like read through issues and read through procedures, so they'll kind of get that stuck in their head. Also, they're writing it, so they're reading it and writing it because they're taking it and transcribing it, or they're taking it and they're taking like rough notes, point form, and they're writing it in paragraphs, or they're taking paragraphs and doing it in bullet form. Doesn't matter. Like, they're reading it, they're writing it, they're maybe interacting with it, they're manipulating it to make it work for a wiki article, but they're also learning the internal intranet sort of structure. They're learning, oh, this is an IT article, so I have to tag it with IT, but then also IT1, because this is for the support level 1 guys. And then they're able to easily see in the future, like, those little things are really important, because if they're searching for something and they find it and they're like, oh, who's tagged in here? IT1. Oh, I better call IT1. They're probably the guys that handle this. Or like, I'll text my buddy in IT1 and like, they'll be able to handle this. Or, oh, like, this is actually for the graphic designers. This isn't for the front end devs because it's tagged this way. So whatever the procedure is, I know that, like, obviously, like, a lot of companies probably don't have wikis and this and that, but a lot do, especially the really big ones, and especially the ones that literally need it because they have so much history, let's say. Usually it's older companies as well. So having the junior guys write out those articles, that they can. Some of them are just too complex or too important that the senior guys have to write it. But having them write out stuff, or if you're in IT, like making them do the network diagrams that go onto the intranet and stuff like that, that really gives them, because they know what they wrote, they're going to learn a bunch of that, they're going to know how to reference the wiki now, they're going to know how to search in that wiki, they're going to know how to write in that wiki when they themselves graduate to a point where they solve an issue that needs to have its own KB or knowledge base article written for it, and they'll understand that procedure. But the most important thing is the fact that because you're reading and writing it and reading and writing it just like you do in school, you're going to be well versed in whatever it is you put on that wiki. And you're going to be learning the company procedure as well. And you're going to be able to answer more of your own questions by asking the wiki for help when the wiki's there. So, for example, if you were to write the wiki yourself and you write a bunch of like wiki articles over the years, whatever, and then you have some weird issue with, I don't know, images aren't rendering, I don't know. So you then say, okay, I'm going to go look this up in the wiki. So you go and you look up in the wiki and it's like images aren't rendering, and you find like half of your answer. Approaching another dev saying, hey, I looked on the wiki, I found this, but like I'm still having this issue and I'm not really sure. Like that shows that, and like Mike's already touched on this a bit here too, is like that shows that you've put your time in, and it also allows them to like maybe quickly scan that article and be like, yeah, you know what, there is something either A, missing from that KB article that needs to be fixed or added, or it allows them to say like, yeah, okay, this junior guy did do his work. He did check into it. He knows, he did, he checked Google, he checked the intranet site, he checked everything. Okay, now I'll help. He didn't just like say like, hey, I don't know what I'm doing.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good onboarding practice. Like one of the first, tasks for a junior developer should be doing something in the intranet docs, right? Like either editing them, adding one, like, a good exercise would be like mirror or shadow a developer that's doing some sort of, administrative work on the project, whether it's cleaning up code, and document that process, add it to the docs, right? And then that gives them that opportunity to go through and make sure that they're on the doc, or like going through and making sure, like documenting what technologies are used on what projects in the company, so that it's in the READMEs or something like that. So I think that's a really good practice. Like that's super good start for a developer because, again, it's getting them comfortable with the docs, it's getting them comfortable with other developers, and it's giving them that base knowledge of what the company's been doing. So it's like a win-win-win for everyone.
Super boring, though.
Oh, yeah. It could be super boring. But again, it's one of those things where you get them to do it for like, a few days, like a couple days at most. And just to get them started. But really, you should be loading them up with other stuff as well. It's just part of their onboarding process. Right?
Yeah, like an hour at the end of the day or something for a month or whatever it is.
That's the thing. You want it to be just part of their days, not their whole day, obviously. I was gonna have another discussion on rubber duck debugging, but I'm actually gonna save that for the show notes. So that's something that I wanted to talk about in my weekly growth goal. So I'm gonna go right to that because I'm running a little bit short on time right now. So my weekly growth goal for last week was creating a new show note template that has like timestamps and has like just the regular information that we need to provide for our show notes to make it so that our podcast episodes are a little bit more searchable, a little bit easier to digest quickly and to understand if you want to listen to it and find it easy and stuff like that. So we've actually started posting all of our show notes currently on dev.to. I'm going to be linking them in our actual like podcast episode. So if you look back the last 4 or 5 episodes that you're going to see, they're all going to have a little show notes link. You can check it out. I would love for you to kind of go in, check out our show notes, check out the structure, and provide us some feedback. Maybe leave a comment on the show notes because it'll give me a good indication of what I need to kind of improve on, what you like, what you don't like, and we can kind of have a conversation there about what to do next. So again, it's going to be on dev.to. It's under my name, so Mikhail Karan, but regardless, I'm going to actually put the link to the show notes in our podcast episode. So if you just go to the podcast episode on Podbean or on Castbox or wherever you get your podcast, you're going to see that link to the show notes and you should be able to find it from there. In the future, I want to say that these show notes and this template that we're building, it's still like kind of actively being adjusted, is going to be present on our website, the htmlthings.com website, which is currently being built out. This dev.to portion is just kind of a temporary thing so that they're at least out there and we're kind of getting into the habit of writing the show notes. And onto the habit part, my new weekly growth goal is going to be write something every day. So I've already kind of cheated a little bit and I've been writing something every day for the past week or so because I've been writing each show note out for the like previous episode. So I want to continue that because it's kind of been a good way for me to start my day. Just even if it's like a couple sentences or a couple paragraphs, I'm not going to say I'm going to publish something every day, but I want to at least write something. So I want to get some of the knowledge that I have out there. I want to do some research and write it out and stuff like that. Like I want to just continue that habit a little bit longer. So again, my weekly goal for next week is to write something every day.
I mean, that's great. That's a good growth goal, and I kind of like the idea of like saving a little something for the show notes. I don't know if I'll stick with that. That's just kind of an interesting idea. I know we're doing it for time right now, but it'd be kind of interesting to have like a little bonus in the show notes. I don't know if I want to like starve the show though. I don't know, just spitballing at this point. But for my weekly growth goal was to keep my head above water, and I'm here, so I did. However, disaster has struck, so as all migrations do. So we got to do another migration as a result, and an unforeseen sort of more of an office politics situation more than like a technical one. So we have to do another migration, although there's some other organization and stuff like this involved with it and yada yada. So I'll be doing that. However, I did finish every single project on time last week. I finished 2 websites and a migration all on time. With very minimal sleep. I did 1 16-hour, 2 14-hour, and 1 19-hour day. Damn. So the 19-hour day was like I had to take a personal day due to medical stuff or whatever, blah, 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 for family. Not going to get into that, but I had to, I was awake for 19 hours. So yeah, like it was a hellish week last week. This week is, it was looking better, but now it's looking like it might be more hell. Who knows? I'm still organizing some of that, but basically just dealing with all the, feedback and fallout and communication and whatever of all the stuff that was completed and sent out last week. So I'm here, I'm alive, so I beat my weekly growth goal, and I think my weekly growth goal for the second week in a row is going to be to keep my head above water, because I'm just trying to literally get through all of this, because once everything is, billed, paid out, everyone knows how to log into their stuff, everyone knows how to, edit their sites and do whatever they need to do, then I will be able to move on to something else. But it's just been a crazy week. That's just the way it's been, and that's just it. Another week I keep my head above water, but anyway, we're going to run the old conclusion here. If you want to support the show, you can check us out on that Patreon. That's patreon.com/HTML all the things. Check out the tiers, give that a go. Many thanks to our $3 tier patrons. Sean from RabbitWorks JavaScript on youtube.com/RabbitWorks JavaScript. Garrick from Local Path Computing and Web Design on localpathcomputing.com. Ryan Gatchell from Blue Black Digital on blueblackdigital.com. Chris from Self-Made Web Designer on selfmadewebdesigner.com. Tim from The Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com. DL Ford from dlford.io. Bib Hashdash from 9block Media on 9blockmedia.com, and Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review on the platform that you are listening to this on, and this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things Podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.